Well, thank you, Ernesto. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. And thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday afternoon for being here with us in person or by Zoom. And I want to thank the Latin American Caribbean Studies Program, more generally Bill Phelan for organizing the event and taking care of the Zoom aspect as well. But especially Ken for joining me today. And, Ken has been part of this book in different ways throughout, with a lot of advice, a lot of guidance. We're just talking about a book workshop that took place a few years ago, sponsored by the Latin American Caribbean Studies Program as well. And now here it is. So the book came out in the summer of 2022, and now it's out. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be able to be here and participate in a discussion about Gustavo's new book. Especially, it's rewarding for me, having lived through some of the early stages of the book as you were thinking about it and beginning the research, and we had the workshop that you mentioned a number of years ago, and I know how much time goes into writing one of these and how long it can take before it finally comes out. But when it finally does, it's really rewarding to have it come out in print. And I think this is a very important book for the study of Latin American politics and Latin American political economy. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us here at Cornell to recognize the contributions that this book is making and the hard work that Gustavo has done to bring it to fruition. I just want to start with the way we're going to run this is I'll have a dialogue with Gustavo for a little while. I'll pose a number of questions and give him a chance to reflect upon the writing of the book and its many contributions to the field. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers in about 30 or 40 minutes and give others a chance to participate as well. Okay. Gustavo, I think I'd like to start by asking you, what was the central puzzle that you set out to address in this book? And I ask that because I think all great books, and I think this is a great book, but all great books have some sort of puzzle, something that is unexpected or something that the literature does not anticipate or does not explain very well. So there's a central puzzle that is at the core of any great book. And I would like to hear your thoughts as to what drew you into this topic. Was there a particular puzzle that led you to want to work on this, to try to answer a question that was puzzling to you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, the name of the book, the title is Contemporary State Building, Elite Taxation and Public Safety in Latin America. And it's a title that sort of brings in different topics that people don't necessarily think of them in the same sentence. So at the core, the puzzle of the book is, we often hear about the difficulty that governments have, not only in Latin America, but in every country, to tax people in general, but especially economic elites, right? To tax the wealthy. And this is for a number of reasons. The wealthy can more easily circumvent tax obligations, both legally and perhaps not so legally in a variety of ways. But the question is, how, if economic elites are a lot harder to tax, how is it that some Latin American countries have been able to do so in the context of considerable state weakness? In other words, if this is a hard thing to do for countries like the United States, perhaps in Europe, in which there is state capacity, some ability to tax elites, to really go after them, have laws in place and enforcement of these laws. Latin America, it's a different ballpark. It's a different story. We have institutional weakness. We have governments that, first of all, don't necessarily know the extent of the economic activity taking place. They don't necessarily know where the wealth is. And even when they do, they have a very hard time going after that to tax it, both because of sort of the pushback of elites themselves and sometimes even state capture, right? Sort of certain groups in society, often economic elites themselves, that can capture the state and sort of serve their own interests, let's say. So the origin of this book was this realization that even in this very difficult context, in this hard combination of institutional weakness, you can still have instances in which governments can successfully tax economic elites. And not only that, but they can put that tax revenue to what I would say is a good use. In this case, to address one of the main challenges that many Latin American countries are facing, which is public safety.
Okay. Let me just follow up on that then. And could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Latin America's problems with criminal violence and other kinds of violence? How is that related to the weakness of the state? This is a central theme that is woven through your book, and the need for states to have greater taxation, just to have greater revenues to try to respond to the problems. But one of the things that's very powerful in your book is you talk about the level of the problem with violence in Latin America. That these even with the end of the civil wars. I remember when I was younger in the 70s and 80s, there were civil wars in a number of Latin American countries, very high levels of political violence. What's striking now is with the end of the civil wars, levels of criminal violence have increased in much of the region. In fact, as you point out in the book, Latin America is the most violent region in the world. And so I guess the question then is, how is this related to certain patterns of state development or certain weaknesses on the part of the state that can be addressed then by increasing taxation on elite actors?
So the part of the title is contemporary state building. In part, I think we often think of state building as a process that took place many years ago. Perhaps during the independence period in Latin America, when states were young and becoming sort of their own countries. But I think it's important to think about state building as an ongoing process, and not something that just took place at that point in time, but something that is taking place all the time, every day. And sort of this construction of the state can have many dimensions. I would argue that two that are central to state building are taxation, sort of the revenue side, and on the other side, we have public safety as one of the main tasks that people, let's say, put governments in charge of. Right? And I think people can disagree as to whether governments should be in the business of providing, let's say, public, health services or even public education. But I think most people would agree that governments, one of their fundamental tasks is to provide public safety. And Latin America, has become, as you well said, the most violent region in the world. And there's certainly variation across the region. Some countries have extremely high homicide rates or rates of violent crime. We're thinking about places, Honduras or Colombia, El Salvador, and so recently, El Salvador is an interesting case in terms of statistics of violent crime, but, really, really high, over 40, 50, 60 homicides per 100,000 people. And then there are other places like Chile or Argentina where we don't think of violent crime as being especially salient. But one thing that is very different today, and that I think has prompted some of this willingness among some groups in society that might be otherwise reluctant to pay taxes, is that the nature of violence is not sort of state sanctioned, it's not organized perhaps by the state and directed towards certain groups in society, the way we saw, say, in the 70s and 80s during some of the military dictatorships. But instead, it seems to be a lot more random, if you will. And this randomness of violence means that some groups in society, say business elites, economic elites, might have much less control over this violence. It can very well affect them at any point in time. And this is something that generates what I, in the book, refer to as windows of opportunity for these state-building moments. So violence, I think, plays a key role in this story, not only because it's one of the main challenges for the region, but because in some countries, it can very, very directly affect economic elites. and it affects their personal safety, their personal well-being, their own families, their bottom line as well. So their firms, their companies. And what is interesting about public safety is that it is somewhat different from other, let's say, public services that can be provided or public goods. So if we think about public safety compared to, say, public education or public health services, education and healthcare can be privatized, and economic elites can find that in the private marketplace. And if they don't like the quality of private education, private healthcare in their countries, they could even go abroad and find that care. So if I'm, let's say, a very wealthy Colombian and I don't find the medical care that I need in Colombia, I can still go to fly to Houston, fly to Miami, and find that care. And if I don't like the public schools in Bogota, I can send my kids to a private school, let's say. Public safety is different in that I can privatize public safety up to a point, and I can hire bodyguards. I can live in a gated community. I can drive an armored vehicle. But at the end of the day, I'm still living in fear. I'm perhaps reducing the chances of victimization, but not erasing them altogether. And there's still a higher cost of doing business that is affecting my bottom line. So, it's a very interesting change in the way that this particular group in society understands violence and how it affects their own well-being and status in the social hierarchy.
I think one of the interesting findings, and perhaps you might say a counterintuitive finding in your book, follows from that. And it's an argument you make based on the empirical work you've done, suggesting that economic elites in Latin America may be more willing to pay taxes for public safety than they would for other kinds of public goods, related to social welfare, other kinds of. I wonder if you want to say a few more words about that.
Yeah. So it is so interesting to see that even in the context of extreme public safety crises, again, we're talking about places where the homicide rate can reach 60 homicides per 100,000 people. Just for to provide a point of reference, in the U.S., the national homicide rate, depending on the year, but it can be 6, 7 homicides per 100,000. We're talking about just several orders of magnitude higher. And even in these contexts, elites are reluctant to pay more in taxes. So I did not find a single experience in which elites said, yes, this is a major problem. I think it is important for us to pay more in taxes to try to address this issue. Instead, what we see is elites say, well, I already pay enough in taxes. This is a problem that the government has and needs to address with the resources it already has. If the government needs additional resources, it should look for other sectors of the population that are not already paying in taxes, right, or contributing in the form of taxes. And I mention this, or I emphasize this, because I think there's an explanation in the literature that focuses on the role of crises and how crises will make people tolerate situations that otherwise they wouldn't, right? Sort of this bitter medicine, perhaps, that people might be willing to swallow in a crisis context. But I think there's a real limit to that explanation in this context in Latin America, and I think it's not only in this contemporary context in which elites may be unwilling to contribute more in taxes. It's so interesting to read accounts of efforts to get elites to pay taxes, even during, let's say, the War of the Pacific between Chile and Peru, in which you're fighting an existential war between two countries, and elites are still just not particularly bothered as to whether one day they're part of Peru or the next day they're part of Chile. As long as these governments leave them alone, they don't really care. So as long as it doesn't personally affect them, and I don't think this is not to say, oh, well, elites are amoral and perverse. I think it's a fairly rational behavior. And one of the main obstacles to overcome here is the challenge of getting elites to trust that governments will actually do what they say they will with these additional resources. So there's this, I think, psychology of persuading elites to act on a challenge that is clearly affecting them, but it's a real collective action problem, right? It's something that costs can be very highly concentrated on elites if they pay more in taxes, and the benefits are diffuse. So overcoming that is I think at the one of the main lines of the book, how to get to overcome that mistrust and solve that collective action problem.
So just responding to that, then, I mean, one of the key arguments in the book, a very important argument, is, as you were just referring, it's the notion that crises alone are not going to induce elites necessarily to pay greater taxes. That crises may create an opportunity for governments to try to tax elites for public security, but there's certainly nothing automatic about that. And so, could you say a little more? What are the conditions then? Because there's a lot of variation in your work. I should put, the book includes, looks at a number of different cases. There's Mexico, there's Colombia, there's Costa Rica, there's El Salvador. And so there's considerable variation across these cases as to whether or not states are able to convince the elites to pay higher taxes in the name of public safety. And so what are the conditions that make it more or less likely that elites are willing to do this? I mean, it's a political challenge at the end of the day. You're saying there's nothing automatic about the process. You have to understand the underlying politics of taxation themselves. So what are the underlying politics that create the conditions that are conducive to taxation?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, what I find helps overcome this trust issue and this collective action problem has to do with the extent to which governments can generate, let's call it, a credible commitment toward addressing the issue. And the way to do this is, one way to think about it is, how do I address the concerns of elites? How can I get elites to trust that they can give me more money as a government, that I'm not going to embezzle it or waste it or spend it in education or something that they might not care about at this particular point in time? And it's a challenging thing, especially given, the history of corruption and embezzlement in Latin America, the weakness of the state, the sense that even if the state really wants to do something and sets out to do something, it is often unable to do that. And this goes from, delivering the mail to collecting trash, let alone addressing sort of the issue of violent crime that is often associated with, these drug trafficking organizations that are like beasts with many heads. So how to do this? Well, I would point to governments generating the right conditions by creating these linkages with the business sectors. And one way to think about it is, well, these sectors are the ones that have the resources, the additional resources that governments need. And whether we like it or not, the governments need to figure out a way to reach them and convince them that this is a worthy enterprise. So linkages between governments and the business sectors can be formed in different ways. One of the key political angles in the book is a little bit of this Nixon goes to China aspect or effect. And by this I mean right of center governments have an easier time establishing these linkages with the business sectors. And this, on the one hand, might seem intuitive in the sense that, well, clearly, right of center governments might have just more natural connections with business sectors. But on the other hand, it is counterintuitive, I think, in that right of center governments tend to be much less willing to increase taxes, for instance. We typically associate higher tax burdens with the left, with left of center governments. In this case, whenever there are right of center governments that are able to establish these connections with the business sectors, and by connections, I mean mechanisms of communication, mechanisms of cooperation, that are these permanent linkages throughout the administration or the government, and that they can establish these cooperation channels such that what the government is doing is clearly communicated to elites, that elites in turn are able to shape those plans that the government has and the way of addressing the issue. That is one key political angle that surfaces in the cases that are successful stories of elite taxation. And it does not mean that left of center governments are unable to do this. I think it means that left of center governments struggle more to some extent. And again, the point of departure is that elites are very reluctant to do this to begin with. But right of center governments seem to have an easier time getting them to pay more in taxes. So there's the ideological aspect on the one hand, but there's also the institutional aspect on the other. And this has to do with the design of the taxes themselves. And I find that there are three key institutional design features of these taxes that are important to assuage elites or bring down these concerns. And I would say that first and most important is to have a clear connection between the taxes and the spending in public safety. So earmarking of the additional tax revenue is crucial. And in some countries, this happens formally, whenever it's legal to do so. In some countries, it's not legal to directly earmark revenue that might go into a general tax fund for a particular expenditure. And even in those cases, symbolically, the government had to make it very clear that the revenue from this tax would go for that particular purpose. So earmarking is one design feature. A second has to do with setting limits in the collection of the tax, such that these taxes would automatically sunset. And if we think about it, this is a very important part that has to do with the time horizons of the tax, and the way that elites at least can say, let's give this experiment a try. We'll perhaps giving you additional funds as long as first you spend them in public safety, and second, there is an expiration date on the tax, let's say. So in some of the successful experiences, let's say in Colombia, for instance, often every 4 years, the tax would sunset automatically, and the legislature had to debate it again, take it on, and reapprove it. And so that was a second important feature of the tax. The third feature I would point to has to do with civil society oversight. And civil society oversight can mean a number of things. But I think in this case, just broadly understood, is the involvement of different sectors of society such that elites can at least have a sense that this money is going where it needs to go. It's going to public safety, that it's not being embezzled. And this serves the purpose, certainly, to try to avoid corruption and embezzlement, but also the purpose of making sure that it goes toward this objective or expenditure that elites themselves think of as a priority, which is public safety. So, there's variation depending on the country. Countries, I should say, where these taxes were adopted with these institutional features and where we have a right of center government sort of pushing for these. We have the case of Colombia, we have the case of Honduras. Then we have a left of center government in El Salvador that first attempted to do this without taking into account elites' concerns all that seriously, I would say. This is during the Funes administration. Funes comes from, the FMNL, very, very sort of leftist administration. And there was a lot of mistrust between the government and elites. And that effort failed. But then the following administration, also from a leftist government, Sanchez Seren administration, a former guerrilla himself, Sanchez Seren, there's a real effort to address these concerns, to work with elites, to put in place these mechanisms. And what happens there is that mistrust is at least partially addressed. And we see that there's an adoption of an elite tax or a set of elite taxes that is perhaps not as targeted, not as strongly targeting elites as we see in Colombia or Honduras, in places where there's this clear linkage between government and business sector. So I think there's the variation in the region can be explained by the extent to which these institutional features are adopted and the extent to which the ideology of the governments themselves contributes all of these together to address the concerns of elite. And whenever this happens successfully, we see fairly meaningful taxation, elite taxation taking place. In some places, like in Colombia, we see an additional 1% of GDP in tax revenue, which is fairly significant in general, but especially in Latin America, very tax to GDP ratios move very, very gradually in Latin America, and an increase in 1 percentage point is fairly significant.
Yeah, especially given the very low levels of taxation in general in the region which you talk about. So it's a region. I mean, Latin America sort of stands out in your book. You talk about how it's the region with the highest levels of criminal violence. It's the region with the steepest social and economic inequalities. And then also a region that is well below the regression line in terms of levels of taxation relative to GDP. So Latin America is, in comparative terms, very lightly taxed compared to other places in the world, Brazil being the main exception. But it's interesting in your analysis of the different cases, you come up with this counterintuitive finding that conservative governments are more likely to be able to get elites to pay the taxes than leftist governments. But you do show that it's not impossible for the leftist governments to do so, but you get a different kind of taxation that takes place. It tends to be more diffuse in the extractive process rather than just being concentrated on elites. And the level of taxation tends to be a little bit less. So you get some variation there in where you do get new forms of taxation taking place. But it's also quite interesting, sort of a case that jumps out of the book for me is the Mexican case, where you do have right-wing governments for much of the story until quite recently, but you had conservative governments, and yet they didn't. At the state, at the subnational level, you had some provinces, imposing wealth taxes for public security, but at the national level, you don't get that. So maybe you can say something about the Mexican case and what makes it stand out, and what analytical leverage do you get from the fact that Mexico appears to be an outlier in some ways in the story?
Yeah, the Mexico case is very interesting because it is certainly, I mean, you've seen Mexico in the news, right? It's a country that is facing a real challenge in terms of violent crime. It had, as Ken said, had right of center administrations for quite some time. And we do not see the adoption of this sort of elite taxation for public safety purposes in this country, at least not at the national level. And, when the public safety crisis opens this window of opportunity, it doesn't mean that governments will necessarily think about this as a policy option. And there are different ways in which governments can think to address this. One is, well, with existing resources, perhaps shifting resources away from social services or other aspects, right? They say, well, we're just going to shift that. But whenever, in the book, one of the main reasons in my conversations with elites that I find one of the main reasons why in Mexico we do not see this at the national level is that in Mexico, there's also quite a bit of variation in terms of the extent to which violent crime affects economic elites. And even though Mexico currently has, rates of homicides of about, again, depending on the year, but let's say 26 or so homicides per 100,000 people, some municipalities concentrate a lot of the violence and have homicide rates of 60, 70, 80 homicides per 100,000. And others, these rates are much, much lower. And I look into the extent to which economic elites themselves are directly affected by this violence. And in the case of Mexico, Mexico City is not a particularly violent city within Mexico. And even within the Mexico City's rate of violent crime, there is quite a bit of variation, and the wealthiest areas they have among the lowest rates of violent crime. Now, certainly this doesn't mean that economic elites only stay in those parts of Mexico City, although there is a lot of that. One would say, well, certainly they have to travel for their own businesses, they have to travel to other parts of Mexico, and this is true. What we see instead in Mexico is that there's this adoption of elite taxes at the regional level, at the state level. Mexico is a federal system. And in a place like Monterrey, for instance, which is Mexico's second largest city, second wealthiest city, is sort of the industrial hub of the country. And in Monterrey, whenever there was a spike in violence around the late 2000, early 2010s, in particular 2011, there was a surge in violent crime, and there was a sense that something needed to be done. The government tried to adopt, sort of work with elites to do something to get more resources. And at the state level, these elite taxes were adopted. It's one example. There are other states in which this has happened as well, in Sinaloa and other parts. And what we see is that the level of violence seems to be less important than whether governments and elites can work together and whether the violence is actually very directly affecting economic elites. So elites in Mexico City, again, obviously violent crime in Mexico City is something that is in the media all the time, is something that is top of mind for most Mexicans, but is not felt or has not been felt among Mexican elites in Mexico City the same way that it has or had been felt, let's say, in elites in Colombia in the 2000s, for example, or elites in El Salvador, in Honduras. And also, very interestingly, one of the cases in the book is the case of Costa Rica. Now, we don't typically think of Costa Rica as a place with high violent crime. But what we do see is that violent crime became highly concentrated in Costa Rica, in fairly affluent areas, again, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, to the point where economic elites were really, really panicking about this. And the elite taxes adopted in Costa Rica were not as significant as those adopted in Colombia or other places where violence was much greater and where the linkages between elites and governments were greater as well. But we do see some elite taxes being adopted, and there's this sense of a very direct, very direct consequences of the violence that was rising very quickly and taking place in the country at the time. So, the Mexican case is one in which we don't see this at the national level, but we do see this almost, sort of checkered map subnationally. And governments, right of center governments at the state level had a much easier time working with elites to adopt these taxes. And in some states, the state of Guerrero, for example, the city of Acapulco is often in the news because of violent crime. Some of these arrangements, some of these negotiations were attempted, but they were largely unsuccessful because of the lack of these linkages at the end of the day.
So let me ask a question, maybe a couple of questions about the consequences, starting with the, where you do get new taxation on economic elites for public safety reasons. Is it effective? Do you see, are states able to extract the revenues and use them to strengthen state institutions, the presence of the state, to strengthen police forces, the security forces of the country that are involved in trying to provide public safety? So what do you see as the effectiveness where they have been able to do this, the increased taxation?
One of the reasons why I think these experiences are important to learn from is because not only are they significant from the revenue side in and of themselves, worthy of studying, but also on the expenditure side. And that is what governments have done with that money. And if we think about an increase in taxation of 1% of GDP, that is pretty significant in countries that often struggle to tax the population. If we have this influx of resources going directly toward public safety, and having more police officers, having more police cruisers, vehicles, weapons, and so on, intelligence equipment, it can have a meaningful impact in the public safety landscape. Now, the book does not get directly to establish whether these taxes have a causal effect on the levels of violent crime in the region. But there is, I think, some suggestive evidence that shows that in places where these taxes were adopted, and then this money was channeled toward public safety, there's some suggestive evidence that rates of violent crime experience a downward trend in the aftermath of these taxes. These taxes, even though in theory they were temporary because by design they have a sunset provision, the reality is that they're taxes that are very hard to roll back. And that is both because they're earmarked for public safety. So governments are reluctant to incur the costs, the political costs of saying, well, I'm going to be the government that is not as invested in public safety. We're going to end this tax now. So that's one. But also, once there's a sense, whether it's real or not, that these taxes might be making a difference in the public safety landscape, they also become sort of self-fulfilling, right, or self-reinforcing. And this is certainly what happens in Colombia. When the first time that this tax was adopted during the Uribe administration in 2002, the tax was adopted during a state of exception, meaning that the legislature did not approve the tax. So the government declared a state of exception. The tax was adopted under these circumstances, circumventing the legislature, let's say. And about a year later, Congress took on the issue, and there was this generalized sense that the tax seemed to be working. And this contributed to an important extent in convincing, say, the public, legislatures, certainly business elites, that this was something worth approving in the legislature and worth continuing with and worth paying. So in terms of the implications, you have sort of just generating that ability to tax a sector of society that traditionally, historically has been very difficult to tax. You have an injection of resources into public safety, and you also have some implications that have to do with, I would say, perhaps more normative dimensions and more issues of representation and democracy that go beyond the arena of state capacity. And what I have in mind with this is one of the important implications of this is de facto you have a group of economic elites deciding what the money is spent for, deciding that this is a priority for them and that the money should be spent in this fashion. You have governments going along with this, and it becomes a little bit of a de facto parallel Senate of sorts, or oligarchic Senate, in which you are shifting away some of the real decision making where the money is, away from the representative bodies that are elected, the legislature itself, and into some parallel mechanism in which you are, this is, I do not want to imply that this isn't benefiting society more generally beyond economic elites, but from a representation perspective, I think it has interesting implications as well. There are certainly trade-offs. At every point of the chain, trade-offs that are involved in the earmarking of taxation, which has, one can think of perverse consequences, but also politically how it can be very beneficial to earmark taxation with specific expenditure, let's say expenditures that I care about. On the public safety side, there are trade-offs in terms of your sort of generating an injection of resources into the punitive arm of the state, which also, we can think of trade-offs there and how desirable that might be. And then on the representation side, you're also doing this in a somewhat parallel fashion with certainly trade-offs.
You just responded to what was going to be my last question. I wanted to ask about the implications of this for democracy, where you are, trying to create greater public safety, which is certainly a public good, but on the other hand, you are in some ways empowering elite actors and enhancing their own leverage over the revenues of the state and the policies of the state. And so I think you did, you help us understand the nature of the trade-offs that are part of this. And I think this is one of the implications of the impact of violence on Latin American democracies. Is something that we're all quite concerned about. I think at this point it'd be great to open it up and see if we have some questions from the audience and give others a chance to chime in. So I thank you for your responses to my questions. But let's go ahead and open it up, and I'll see what thoughts you may have.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. Ken, this has been a really great conversation for someone who's not a comparativist, who doesn't study the region. So maybe I've learned a little bit more than others today. So I have two questions, if I could, on the puzzle, and then one of these counterintuitive findings. Let's start with the counterintuitive findings. So Gustavo, you talked about trust being integral to being vulnerable to taxation. In this case, elites, as I take it, having not read the book, unfortunately, but looking forward to, are reticent for taxation because the funds could potentially be misused. And this seems to be like a social psychological sort of understanding of the reason why they wouldn't be taxed. I wonder what you think about the potentially competing alternative explanations of just expected utility. So cost benefit analysis, if I'm taxed more, I don't make as much, I don't retain as much. Or even the social psychological implications of prospect theory. So in the domain of losses, people take more risks. In the domain of gains, they take less risks. And so I'm wondering how your findings dialogue with those competing explanations. And then the other thing, too, I think is interesting to think about your central puzzle from the flip side, which is to say, what do you think the implications of your argument in research are for strong state capacity but poor taxation? So think about the United States, where the wealthiest of Americans sometimes, in some cases, aren't taxed whatsoever. They're just living off the pork of an annual return on massive sort of savings accounts. Mm-hmm. And that's well beyond the scope of your book, but I'm interested nevertheless.
Yeah. So these are all very, I think, important and interesting questions. And let me try to take the first one, the one about, sort of these perhaps different ways in which elites can think about the decision to pay more in taxes or not. And, I didn't mean to imply that the book only focuses on trust as sort of as almost a personal level relationship with a ruler, let's say the president in the case of most Latin American countries. And whether it is, are we close enough that I buy that you will honor this? Although there's definitely that, in the Colombian case, for example, in conversations with people that were at meetings between the government and sort of the top sort of business organizations and the leadership of these organizations in Colombia, there definitely was a sense that there was a bit of a sort of a, for lack of a better word, a gentleman's pact. And there were plenty of female business people in the room, right? But I'm going to use that term, a gentleman's pact. So there's definitely that. But in my conversations with elites, there wasn't much. Sort of the bottom line was central to these decisions, right? It was not a sentimental consideration. It was not sort of I think there was a good dose of patriotism and wanting to improve society. This is not a book, by the way, in which elites are portrayed as, again, sort of this greedy sector of society that is hindering the development of the state. I think it's just portrayed, or at least my attempt is a fairly rational sector that is just trying to navigate these challenges the way that other sectors might to protect their own interests, and as a necessary partner for governments in the state building enterprise. So the other mechanisms you suggested, one sort of expected utility, there is a lot of evidence in my mind and in the book about how the calculations that elites were making, and they wanted to make sure that this money, this concentrated burden that they were going to shoulder, would yield results that would be noticeable, and they would in turn sort of come back to benefit them both personally and their own businesses. And certainly the issue of how they would consider, you mentioned prospect theory as well. Well, you from the very beginning have to give up these taxes for the promise of benefits, which complicates things. But elites in Colombia, for example, had had some experience with other ways in which the government had tried to collect more revenue. And in the 90s, for instance, the government experimented with collecting money through peace bonds or war bonds, or they adopted different names, but essentially these were bonds. The government would borrow money from elites, and then it would sort of pay them back along the way. You can see differences between bonds and taxes, and how some would be more desirable than others. So if you tell me, okay, I'll lend you money, you pay me interest along the way, and then I get my money back, that will be a lot more desirable than I have to now give you money, and I'm not going to get any of that back. I'm not going to get any interest, but there's this promise. There are different reasons why the Colombian government opted for this change, but I think it speaks to the real conundrum that elites were in or have been in Latin America, and that is how to try to address the issue of public safety, that it can be very real, while protecting also their own interests. And it is true, I think, in Latin America that countries, in most countries, economic elites pay the vast majority of taxes that are collected. Right, so there's the vast majority of the population, the share that they contribute in taxes is very, very small in Latin America. So, since that was a long-winded answer to your first question, I'll try to give a much shorter to the second one, which, I think it's a wonderful question. If you have strong state capacity, like in the US, and you see lower levels of taxation, I think that has to do with the, I'm going to call it a social consensus, even though the name may be misleading because it's hard to agree on anything in the US these days. And, I don't want to imply that there's a consensus on how much we should tax, but there's certainly an ethos from the very foundation of the country that has to do with the founding story and of low taxation and sort of small government and so on. We can debate whether government today is really small anymore in the US. I don't think it is. But that ethos, I think, plays an important role in establishing some level of taxation, some collectively establishing this level of taxation that is much lower than the US could potentially tax. So I think that has a lot more to do with will to tax, willingness to tax, than capacity to tax in that case.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you for that talk, Gustavo. I think this is a really exciting and important book. I have lots of questions, but I'm just going to ask two, I think. So the first question is, I'm just curious about the civil society oversight you talked about, and that being an institutional feature of taxes. So I would like to hear more about what kinds of civil society organizations those are. Are they typically, also sort of ideologically right of center, or is it a situation where elites are like hand picking certain people, or is it kind of broadly just, what kinds of organizations are those? And I also wanted to ask about, there's a lot of literature coming out about vigilantism. We had Regina Bateson earlier this year, and Eduardo Moncada's his work. And I'm curious if vigilantism and sort of everyday citizens' attempt to respond, if that might be playing a role in these calculations as well. Like if there are sort of successful attempts by citizens to push back, does that make elites say maybe we don't need to invest in this? Or could it go the other way where they say we don't like that this is happening extra legally, and therefore we think we should invest in this? And I'm just curious how your work and the vigilantism work speak to each other.
Yeah, thank you for these questions, Emily. These are also, wonderful questions. On the civil society front, elites are part of civil society, business elites, and they wanted to be part of this oversight mechanism. And whenever these mechanisms were taken seriously, I think these elite taxes were most successful. And in the case of Colombia and Honduras, for instance, the economic elites were very, very much involved themselves, but they weren't the only actors. They also, often the civil society oversight mechanism involved, they would appoint university presidents, for instance, to be part of the group that would oversee how these resources were spent. And a report would be generated every 3 months or so, every quarter or every 6 months, depending on the country, explaining, this is the money that has been collected as part of this tax. This is how it has been spent. And in some cases, with quite a bit of detail, it wouldn't be, we collected this much and we bought, 600 guns. No, it would be, we collected this much, we purchased 600 guns, and we deliver them to this particular, police sector that then in turn distributed them to these particular units, and with quite a bit of detail. So again, this can be seen as a good and a bad thing. But just to answer the question, I won't get into that. So often, certainly it was elites, but often it was other sectors that we typically think of as being perhaps not directly associated with business elites, although, some of these university presidents came from, not all, but from, private universities that perhaps have some ties to the business sectors as well. And there were others, right? Sometimes religious leaders, sometimes NGOs that had to do with these observatories of levels of violence in society and so on. I should also mention that these reports in some countries, again, were very, very well made and very serious. In others, they weren't as detailed, and they were a lot more just as a mechanism for elites to make sure that the state involves in the oversight. And this does not mean that money was not embezzled. I have no way of knowing that. It does not mean that governments weren't spending some of this money perhaps for other purposes, but the perceptions, I think, matter a lot. The earmarking, the limited time horizon of the tax, and the ability to become involved in how this money was collected and spent really helped generate this willingness to pay. Then, regarding vigilantism, I did not, in my conversations with elites, hear sort of the willingness, or whether opposition to the tax, which was expressed very openly, or willingness to pay the tax as responding to whether vigilantism was taking place, or whether certain groups of society were taking sort of matters into their own hands. But the way I see it is that this can be happening in parallel. And let's say, again, the Colombian case is one in which, at the same time that economic elites may be paying these taxes, other ways of funding or sort of addressing the problem was to fund, say, paramilitary groups, or fund, other groups in society that were taking matters into their own hands and needed resources. So we can think of this as diversifying a portfolio of options, right? Again, I have no evidence based on my research that elites were doing both, but I think it's not difficult to see how they would. And what I do see is that, let's say in places like Mexico, in addition to taxes, there were other efforts that were more, let's say, less institutionalized, more one-off in time, in which, say, elites would come together and say, well, we know that the local police department needs new police cars. Well, we'll come together, we'll purchase those for the police department, and here they are, right? So you can think of them as an in-kind donation, not all that different from the types of organizations that we see in the US along the lines of business improvement districts, in which elites also, pay a fee, perhaps monthly, perhaps quarterly or yearly, and then that money can go toward, security guard or other forms of providing public safety. So I think at the end of the day, this is evidence that elites just look for these different ways to try to address the problem, and some of them may be more successful than others. But given the uncertainty, I think it makes sense just to try several of them at the same time.
Just to follow on that, does it make sense for us to think of vigilantism as, essentially a response to the weakness of the state and the inability of the state to control certain territorial spheres and, to maintain public order, right? Ultimately, then, does vigilantism become a surrogate for state capacity in places where you have a significant deficiency of the state?
I think that's right. I think it's a clear indication of this weakness of the state. It's also not something, I mentioned the case of paramilitaries in Colombia and perhaps some elites funding them, but it doesn't mean that vigilantism only takes place, in a way that is connected to elites. There can be a lot of vigilantism that is grassroots, at the grassroots level. And certainly in the case of Mexico, there are experiences in El Salvador, in Honduras, in other parts of the region in which we see this as perhaps almost like a last resort for people that are really just at a loss as to how to address the issue of public safety. And I think, unfortunately, there's evidence that in more and more countries in the region, even in those that we have traditionally not associated with high levels of violence, we're seeing countries moving in that direction, right? So we are more likely to see more and more countries experiencing these higher levels of crime than countries with a lot of crime moving in the other direction today. So I think we're likely to see a lot more vigilantism. We are, and a way to think about it from a state building perspective is that we're likely to see these more and more of these windows of opportunity opening. And it'll be interesting to see whether then governments are able to sort of take advantage of these windows or harness the opportunity to try to generate some still state building momentum of sorts.
Go ahead.
So in one of your answers, Gustavo, you mentioned patriotism, right? And I wanted to ask you about patriotism and the way in which elites deploy their contributions, their tax contributions as part of presenting themselves as patriotic, right? Especially in a context in which in several countries in Latin America with the shifting political ties and right of center governments then seizing the governing to right of left governments, the discourse of some elites shifts from patriotism to, oh, we're going to leave the country. It's like they say which may sound like make the previous expressions of patriotism be a bit superficial or vague. But then the other question related to patriotism has to do with tax structures, because I guess I used to know how the tax structure in Colombia functioned, but not anymore, and I don't know how it functions in the other case studies. Are these all cases?
You're not elite enough to keep track of.
Yes, I know that I was never charged for a peace bond or an elite tax contribution. I never made but in all the cases, are the tax structures centralized, so everyone pays to the central government and the central government then makes region transfers to the regions, or are there also cases of state taxes? So that, because that would make it possible to think of certain expressions of patriotism as being more local than others. Because I'm interested in thinking of the geographic scope of patriotism, right? And for what I study, some people present patriotism as, oh, it covers the whole Spanish Empire, while some others it's like, no, my patriotism is about this specific province, right?
Yeah. So thank you for this, Mr. And this is, I think, a very interesting question in the sense that there are different levels in which we can evaluate how patriotic elites are at the end of the day in paying these taxes. So at one level, I should also say that elites paying these taxes also does not mean that they wouldn't still circumvent some tax obligations. And in the Colombian case, it's interesting. It's an example of something I developed in the book, in the chapter on Colombia, that has to do with what was called the contratos de seguridad jurídica. So this social or this, sort of legal stability contracts of sorts that were arrangements through which the government would guarantee a particular tax arrangement, guarantee it for companies that wish to invest in Colombia, so that if the tax code changed after a few years, they would uphold that same tax arrangement that the company came into the country with. And it, there was a fairly controversial thing, but it really became a mechanism through which a lot of these companies then started to evade sort of these higher tax burdens that were being adopted over time, in part to address public safety. So, it's a fairly nuanced story once one starts getting into the details within countries. So I bring this up to make clear that some elites were paying these taxes, not all elites were paying these taxes, and some elites were still paying, maybe some of the taxes they were needed to pay, and so on. But one can also say, well, at least some elites were paying some of these taxes, as opposed to entirely just leaving the country. Right? And there was a fairly prominent case of a Mexican business person, sort of a leader in the Monterrey business community, who basically came out and said, look, if you have any love for this country, stop moving to Texas and stay here to address the problem. And that means paying more in taxes. That means sort of finding solutions. The Monterrey case is an interesting one in which the business community came together to fund a new police force at the state level. And it's such an interesting mentality. It's sort of this can-do mentality of the business sector in Monterrey, in which they said, basically the problem is that the government is just always paralyzed, incompetent. They don't know how to do it. We'll solve this problem easily. We'll just come together. We'll put our human resources department to hire police. Excuse me. We'll take care of the details. And that's when they figure out that it wasn't just about, we'll just put ads in the newspaper, or, send me your CV if you want to be a police person. And, it was a lot more complicated, but they did channel a lot of resources to generate this, I think, modern police force in the state of Nuevo León that, again, I think there's evidence that it has had some good results. And we could say, well, that strikes me as more patriotic than those who moved their family to Texas, started paying taxes in the US instead of Mexico. Now, can you blame them? I do not, right? I think people make these decisions for very personal reasons. I am the last person to blame Mexicans who don't live in Mexico because I live in the United States myself, right? So, I think there is a lot of variation in terms of how this patriotism materialized and how it played out in different countries. But in terms of the local versus national, in the Mexican case, again, my argument is that because violence was not affecting elites in Mexico City as directly, we do not see sort of this call for a national effort. But at the state level, we do see these taxes being adopted. And the challenge in Mexico is that Mexico is a federal system, but it's not a real, Mexico does not have a real fiscal federalism. And that is, the federal government in Mexico collects the vast majority of taxes in the country. There's very little left for the states and for the local governments. So the challenge became for state governments, well, within our realm of taxation, how can we tax more from elites? But at least that revenue was going directly into state coffers, as opposed to the federal government's coffers.
Was there a question here? Go ahead.
Yeah. Congratulations for the book and also the conversation. It was really interesting. And I couldn't stop thinking about the current Chilean situation. Sorry, I come from there, but it's maybe like a perfect situation for this research, because we have an ongoing tax reform discussion at the same time that the crime rates are increasing really fast. So my question, I have two questions. The first one is about the definition of economic elites, like how specific was, if it was the same for all the cases, and how do you deal with the fact that there's a lot of foreign investors and maybe foreign elites? Maybe should they be included, or were they included in that discussion? Both, I guess, in European or American, but also transnational capital movements. There are lots of that. And related to that, if there was a difference, like between, because the case studies that you mentioned, specifically, I was thinking about Mexico and Colombia. They do have like bigger middle classes, right? So there was any difference happening there in the debates? And the second question, it's related to another variable. If you put like the political system variable in the discussions, in the sense that, I mean, it's a well-known situation that we have presidential systems in or Latin America, and if there were any case where there weren't majorities in the Congress, or there were others where the government did have any, like how did the Congress interact with the elites?
Thank you for these questions. So, by economic elites, these taxes target really, in some cases, sort of the wealthiest 1% of the population. And there's variation across countries in terms of the types of taxes that were leveraged to do this. And at least in the account of the book, the type of tax is a function of the extent to which these linkages were created, such that whenever linkages were strong, we see the most targeted taxes, sort of the taxes that most directly targeted elites. And when linkages were not as strong, the weaker the linkage, the less targeted the tax to incorporate perhaps other sectors of society as well. And to give you an example of the type of taxes that the book discusses, in some cases, they have to do with wealth taxes, such that they say, wealth, anybody with wealth over this threshold has to pay this percentage in tax, which presents challenges, of course, how to, maybe if you're a banker and your wealth comes from banking, that wealth is a lot easier to track than if you're a rancher, cattle rancher, and your wealth is in cows or horses, or agriculture. And there was definitely an interesting difference in how, again, all elites were unwilling to do this, but at the end of the day, how willing some of them became also had to do with their sense of, well, how likely is it that the government will figure out how much I actually, or what my wealth is? So there was some of that. But in any case, these were truly, truly the wealthiest sectors in society, in some cases, perhaps top 5%, top 1%. And in some countries, I have in mind in El Salvador, in which it was a left-of-center government that did not have a majority in Congress, but did end up working with a party, Ghana, that was sort of this breakaway faction from the right-of-center Arena. And it worked with them to adopt these types of taxes, and they ended up being less targeted. So some of them ended up targeting, let's say, luxury goods. And if you target luxury goods, certainly for the most part you'll be targeting elites, but say some upper middle class person might still buy a luxury car. So they're less targeted to some extent, but at least most of them really targeted the top 1%, top 5%. So that's what I mean by economic elites. Those are the types of taxes that were adopted. Sometimes there were exceptions. If there were different classes of companies that were, let's say, if it were in Colombia, sort of the state-owned oil company was not subject to this tax. Sort of these different classes. But for the most part, regardless of whether you were a Colombian citizen or a Mexican citizen, if you have this level of wealth or this level of income, depending on the tax and how it was structured, you would be paying this or contributing to this. And then sort of to your answer about majorities or having majorities in Congress and the role that the legislature played, these taxes tended to be fairly popular in the legislature once governments and elites agreed on some form of arrangement moving forward. And this is because taxing the rich tends to be fairly popular, right? People are not going to be opposing a tax that doesn't affect them. It taxes someone else, but the benefit might accrue to everyone in society or to broader sectors of society. So they were politically popular and they were easily to pass in that sense. But that does not mean they were easy to negotiate with business sectors. And in places like El Salvador, in which a left-of-center government said, all right, business elites, this is what we want to do. if you're not on board, we're really sorry. What the government, the business elites really flex their muscle and show that at the end of the day, through their ties to legislators in Congress, this can be very popular among the general population, but it's not going to pass. So I think it's an interesting lesson that we need to, for these experiences to be successful, there has to be some degree of buying from the business sectors to structure this in a way that is acceptable, right? That it's I think, a win-win for the government, for the business sectors, and certainly for the population more generally.
Any final questions? Okay, if not, I think we've had a very good discussion. So thank you all for coming, and thank Gustavo. Congratulations on the book. It's great to see it out, and it's been a very good discussion. And we'll look forward to hearing more about how the book is received and debated, and how it influences the field.
Thank you, Ken, for your questions. Very thoughtful, and certainly all your help along the way. And thank you all for being here today, and I appreciate the questions and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.